All right, well, good morning once again. We are glad that you all have joined us today for the Rector's Forum. We have a very interesting topic this morning. We're going to be talking about the spiritual, not religious phenomenon in America today. And we are blessed to have Matthew Hedstrom, who is a professor at UVA in the Religious Studies Department, who is an expert on this topic. He's going to kind of unpack it for us and explore what it means for the church and for America today. So Matthew, let's start with a general question, make sure we're kind of all on the same page. What do we mean by the words spiritual and religious? What do those terms mean?
Yeah. Thanks. Start with an easy question. It's a delight to be here. Thanks, Chuck, Justin, Paul, everyone who was part of inviting me here. What do those words mean? There's a sort of question of like, what would the dictionary say they mean? And then there's the question of what sort of folks mean when they deploy them. Right? And oftentimes, I think in a lot of the current conversation, it's kind of, oftentimes, for both understandable reasons and maybe less fair reasons, the category of the spiritual has acquired basically all the things that I like, and the bucket religion gets the things that I don't like, and it doesn't sort of get much more developed than that. And we could talk about that, but I think, broadly speaking, when people are using those words, religion, they think about institutions, they think about formalized doctrine or theology, and spirituality has come to acquire much more individualistic meanings, right? Meanings about kind of finding meaning or finding one transcendence on one's own, sort of one's own path. Those are both ancient words, and for most of their usage, spirituality has been understood as a sort of a dimension or a quality within the religious life. And it's only in the in the 19th century, I think they started to separate, but in contemporary usage, it's sort of the community path, the institutional path, the individual path.
So religion then is sort of tradition. It's something you're entering into that already is well established as a certain framework that you're buying into about what you believe and what you do and practice. And spirituality is maybe a catch-all for kind of creating your own, I don't want to reuse the word spiritual, but your own transcendental experience, your own way of relating to something beyond us, something greater, the divine, whatever term. And you can craft that any way you want, kind of drawing from different traditions or different ideas to sort of fashion your own. Is that a fair summary?
Yeah, I use the metaphor of sort of quilt making in the course that I teach on this, which, is how culture works in general, right? You ask a musician, like, what about their process, and they'll say, well, these are my influences, right? And you sort of, so most things culturally, art, music, literature, whatever it is, people don't invent, or a lot of them, mostly they don't invent. Their invention is kind of drawing things together in new ways. And you use the word transcendental. The historians who study this often point to that period in the 19th century, the transcendentalists, right? People like Emerson and Thoreau finding God in nature, and romantic impulse as part of the beginnings of this separation between the sort of thinking about spirituality as a path that can be pursued outside of the context of formal, traditionally understood religion.
That's helpful. So let's get a sense then of where we stand in 2024. What percentage of Americans in general are spiritual but not religious?
I have a graph. This is sort of well studied. The Pew Research Center does these kinds of surveys. The answer is about 30%, right? So it's actually the largest kind of single religious demographic in the country, right? If you don't take Christianity as a whole, if you sort of divide Christianity into mainline, evangelical, Roman Catholic, these sort of three big blocks. The spiritual but not religious is actually bigger than any of those three categories. I'm just looking at this chart here. In 2007, for example, 16% of Americans identified as having no religion, being religiously unaffiliated is 29% now. So it's a phenomenon that in the 90s, really, the sort of curve started to bend, but in the last decade, accelerating. I mean, year over year, you can see like significant measurable change.
So why is that happening? What happened in the 90s that kind of started this transformation? What do people who identify as spiritual but not religious say their motivations are? Why are they rejecting religion?
Yeah, it's a good question. And in some ways a hard one to answer, but I'll just note this is maybe a point of trivia, but I think a telling one, an interesting one. The phrase itself, spiritual but not religious. I mean, it even has an acronym in like the social scientists and whatever we're studying, SBNR. People just talk about SBNR because it's such a phenomenon. That phrase is about 100 years old. People started using it in the 1920s, but in very scattered ways. It didn't really take off until the 1990s. And our best understanding of why it started taking off in the 1990s, my students love this, is online dating sites. It became a box you could check when you were setting up your profile.
So we can blame Match.com?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, look, I don't think that's what drove the phenomenon, but it drove the label.
Yeah, right.
Right, because in those profiles, if you said that you were, an atheist, there's still a decent amount of kind of ambient, maybe bias, concern about that kind of thing. You seem harsh, you seem judgmental, you seem closed-minded, maybe, those kinds of things. But if you said religious, that would also come with its own set of, especially if you're kind of eager to mingle. People might think you're kind of a stick in the mud. You're not going to be so much fun on a date, or, whatever. And so it became this kind of happy middle space. And I do think actually that is telling to a certain degree, right? The sort of happy middle space. It partly reflects some. If we take the but not religious side of that equation, it shows that by then the category was acquiring a lot of negative associations.
Yeah. What are some of those negative associations? I think we probably have a sense of it, but it's worth spelling it out.
Yeah, so I think just one step larger than that, big picture-wise, is I think it reflects an ongoing, and I would say accelerating, loss of faith in institutions. Mm-hmm. If you looked at polls from, say, the 1950s, do you generally trust your government to look out for your best interests? Right. Do you trust the research that comes out of universities to be, do you trust your doctor? All of those were very high. People were like, yes, I do. These authorities, these institutions are generally well-run, well-meaning, If you look at the data now, none of this will surprise none of us, right? People don't trust any of those kinds of institutions. And so I think for some understandable reasons, the Vietnam War, Watergate, public disinvestment in the common good. I think there are lots of things, but I think to a certain degree, like religion has been brought along with all of those things. There are some religion-specific things, and the polling is pretty clear on this. People will say it's too political, right? I think the religious right, in particular, has reaped what it sowed to a certain degree, or in kind of ironic ways, right? Trying to sort of capture the institutions politically, actually undermining its own credibility in lots of ways. If you talk to young folks, a lot of the issues have to do with gender and sexuality. Hey, does being religious mean that I have to buy into a patriarchal notions? If I'm a woman, I have to hate gay people, these kinds of things. I think often poor response of religious communities to, especially in the Roman Catholic Church, but not entirely, you know, the sex abuse issues, increasingly diverse society, of course, changes in immigration law and other kinds of things, and I think religious institutions haven't always very well accommodated people to, like, what does it mean that my best friend is Hindu? What does it mean that my daughter has married someone who's Jewish? Like, how do I deal with these kinds of things? So yeah, I think all of those things are in the mix.
Now here's a perplexing feature, though, I think, when we think about those factors that have shaped, especially younger people's attitudes about religion. There are lots of religious denominations falling under the headline mainline that would seem to be, therefore, quite appealing to young people.
Yes.
Progressive views about human sexuality and gender are often on the more liberal side politically, are welcoming of all sorts of interfaith type arrangements, and so forth. And yet, in many ways, those denominations have experienced the most significant decline during this period, and a sense of kind of irrelevancy in the society as a whole, which is a stark contrast to their kind of public standing, say, in the 60s, where, you know, magazines would care what, like, the Episcopal Church or the Methodist Church thought about some social issue of the day, and they don't really today. So what's going on with that, then? How do we make sense of that phenomenon?
Yeah, you know, I mean, I'm a faculty member at a public university. I don't provide pastoral care to students, right? But sometimes I come from a family of preachers, and sometimes I feel like that's what the students are asking me. And a number of times I've had students in my office who are wrestling with these questions, and they basically ask me, well, why can't there be forms of, you know, and I just think that this young person sitting in front of me does not know that such institutions exist. Right? I mean, very often. And why is that the case? You know, I think for a long time that the sort of mainline, right? I mean, take that term, mainline, this sense of, like, there was a hubris about many of these institutions that led to not doing as well as they might have at, you know, this sense of just their sort of inevitable, eternal, like, presence in society. I think you look at what evangelicals did, they did a lot better job with, like, you know, summer camps and, I don't know, all this kind of youth stuff and whatever else. But I don't think that's the big picture. You know, there was a famous book that was published in the early 1970s called Why Conservative Churches Are Growing. That was looking at the decline in the main line and what seemed to be the growth of the evangelical churches, and that basically said, oh, you need to provide something that seems more countercultural, right? In other words, like, if what happens on Sunday morning isn't that different from what happens on the golf course with your friends on Sunday morning, then people are going to go to the golf course, right? Like, and so this idea was, like, you present this, like, robustly otherworldly, like, framework, and that's what people will want. That made sense for a while, but it no longer does, because, you know, the Southern Baptist Convention is hemorrhaging members, right? Like everybody is now.
Perhaps it depends on what countercultural means, right? So, I mean, the two things that I've sort of noticed in my ministry over the years is, one, that the media plays a huge role in our understanding of religion. And when you read kind of just mainstream news even, it's getting better, actually. I have to say it's getting better, but there's a superficiality to it, in which political categories are imposed on religious denominations to try to fit it into a framework that people who probably don't have much of a religious background or education are trying to do so that they can make sense of it for their audience. So religion does equal a certain kind of political framework. It's almost explicit in the way that newspaper articles present religious topics and political topics. So if I didn't go to church, or I kind of was a nominal Christian in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, I might not know any different. I might think, exactly like your students, that religion equals this, because that's actually what I read in the Washington Post.
Yeah.
It's what I read on social media. And so part of it is like churches and the media in general have really failed to, it seems, to educate people about the options out there. And then the other thing on the countercultural, it's clear that younger people aren't looking for the countercultural politics that the religious right is offering.
Yeah.
But are they not looking for the sense of transcendence, the sense of meaning-making, the sense of purpose, a life worth living? I think they probably still are looking for those things. And can the church offer that, right? That seems to be the question.
Well, okay, so that's another, that is the other, can the church offer that? I mean, I think the answer is yes, but how many people see that?
Yeah.
You look at the survey data, and it's pretty bleak. You talk about like institution religion, how many butts are in the pews on a Sunday, how does that compare? Look at the, age profile of folks. I mean, right, the trend lines are like this.
Yeah.
And then you see something like, this is also from Pew, this is done, research done last summer, 2023.
Okay.
Percentage of adults who say yes to these things. Are you becoming more spiritual over the course of your life? 41% say yes, 13% say no. Are you becoming more religious over your life? 24% say yes, 33% say no. So Americans are saying, I'm becoming more spiritual, and I'm becoming less religious.
Yeah.
That might be, again, people playing with labels and language, to a certain degree. Like I said, just the way in which the word spiritual sounds like all the happy things, and religion sounds like all the judgy, negative things.
Right.
But I don't think just that, right? So I think that actually is where the opening is, or the kind of glimmer of hope.
Yeah.
If you look at questions like, do you pray regularly? That number has stayed quite high. And it's gone down a little bit, but not nearly as much as like, are you at church on Sunday?
Right.
Do you believe in God? I mean, just basic questions like this. God is doing okay. Like God is hanging in there, right? It's church. It's church that's hurting. Prayer, like if we just think of that in broad terms, is sort of reaching out or listening. In some broad way. I think most Americans would think of that as with, to, and about God, right? That's doing pretty well.
And that's such an important point, isn't it? To say that it's not as though Americans are becoming non-believers.
Right.
In some general sense of the word.
Yeah.
They still believe in God and the supernatural.
Yeah.
They just don't believe in institutional religion.
Yeah, I mean, again, 7 in 10 do,
Yeah, right.
So, like, it's still, but the trend lines
Yes.
are strong in that way. That's right. That's right. And so, in a sense, that's kind of what motivated me to start to want to teach a course and then think about these things. It's like, what is that delta? Like, what is that gap?
Yeah.
Between, and that's, I think, where this category of the sort of spiritual but not religious comes in.
Now, obviously, you're a professor at a public university, and that comes with all sorts of constraints. But when you're talking to those students in your office, or you're talking to us here in this setting, what recommendations would you have for churches, let's say mainline churches, because you're in the mainline church here, for responding to this moment that there seems to be an opportunity to tap into spiritual wants and needs that people have.
Yeah.
We tend to say in the church that everybody actually has a spiritual impulse, and we're all seeking to fill that hole in our soul, so to speak, and only God can fill it. That's a classic Christian claim.
Yeah, Augustine, right?
Right, exactly, yeah. We're restless until we rest in God.
Yeah.
And I see a lot of evidence in my life for that. I see that people chase after all sorts of other gods that they want to worship and put their trust in. So how does the church respond to this moment, that spiritual impulse, when clearly as an institution, we're coming at this from a disadvantage, we can't just kind of do the things we've always done.
Right. I mean, a lot of smart people have been asking this question for a long time, and the trends are continuing to go like this. I don't think
what's your best reflection on that, though? You've thought a lot about this issue.
There's some kind of, there's a sort of, the crassest word would be like marketing dimension, or just like public awareness dimension, right? You're talking about like the media and other things. So I do think that churches, whether that's individual congregations or more broadly denominational level or even larger, kinds of levels, need to be out in the media environment, whether that means on TikTok or on CNN or in the New York, and it means engaged in communities, like publicly visible in the issues of the day, in the issues of the community. That doesn't always, in fact, almost the vast majority of that would mean not in like partisan political ways, but just be sort of visible, be public, be community engaged, be media savvy, so that these questions of like, again, I think of one student in particular who was in my office, who was just like, I really wish there were a kind of institution in which I could think about the Bible and I could pray with others, but just wasn't so, angry about gay people and this and that. And why don't such things exist, And I'm just, so it's like that's telling to me, right? So on the one hand, I do think there's just that sort of, public presence and public witness of what people do, and sort of not be afraid to be, to not just be turning inward, sort of, but I do think also that these questions of the spiritual, churches can't be, I don't think, and thrive if they're just social clubs. And so that notion of, hunger for meaning, hunger for transcendence, locating oneself in frames of meaning that transcend the individual, transcend the human, that connect one across time and space, including, to sort of eternity. Right? I asked a question on the first day of class, an anonymous survey, they fill it out online. I just say, what spiritual practices, if any, are most meaningful to you? We haven't talked about the word or whatever, so it's just kind of my sense of like, what do they bring with that meaning? Every year except for last year, I don't know what was wrong with last year's students. Prayer has been the number one answer, right? So again, 19-year-old UVA students, prayer is their number one most common, most meaningful spiritual practice. And usually, second and third are meditation, mindfulness kind of practices, which might have a kind of more secular, even neuroscientific or Buddhist inflection, but maybe not necessarily, right? So you could, if the word prayer has even seemed too much to have the stank of religion on it, they might call it meditation, but they might still be talking to God and listening to God, So those three at the top of the list, I think that's evidence that there are needs to be met there.
There's a collection, maybe you've read this, Matthew, from C.S. Lewis called God in the Dock. It's a collection of essays and talks and so forth. And God in the Dock refers to the fact that God is sort of on trial, basically. And this is from, I guess, the 50s and 60s mostly. But he has this one essay, and your comment makes me think about this, where he says two things that I think are important. One is that words that we've been using a long time have such heavy baggage and misunderstanding that you need to translate them into new words.
Yeah.
So if you're going to use a word like sin,
Yeah.
You need to explain what you mean by that.
Yes.
And he actually has a glossary, basically. Don't use these words, and explain what you mean by these words. But I think the most important thing he says is, what the church needs are Christians just being Christian in their everyday life.
Yes.
Like, if you're a doctor, don't hide your Christianity and pretend like it doesn't exist, but just embody it.
Yeah.
And as it comes up organically, note it, reference it, whatever. That the best public witness in terms of telling people about Christianity is just to be a Christian in the world. We don't necessarily need more preachers and theologians. We need people who don't sort of sequester their Christianity into a private sphere, disconnected from the rest of their life. And that goes a long way to exposing people to a different kind of Christianity. Even though I am a preacher, I have found that is very true in my life. I'll be just sitting around a fire pit somewhere or at a party, and it's amazing how often the very fact that I'm an Episcopal priest will come up in a conversation and it will be a spark for, wow, that's kind of weird. What's that about? Or how did it get there?
Yeah.
And it's amazing, but I have seen several dozen people in my life start coming to church just through those encounters. But I think people who had a spiritual impulse, but they needed to meet somebody in a religious context, that there could be that sort of, oh, maybe I could do that. Maybe I could be part of that institution.
Yeah. Well, now I'm going to sound much more like the preacher's kid that I am, and less like the professor at UVA that I am. When God wanted to reveal God's self to the world most robustly and abundantly, it was incarnationally.
Right, exactly.
Right? And there's a common phrase that kind of drives religious studies professors crazy. It's more common in evangelical circles, but say, oh, Christianity isn't a religion, it's a relationship. Or, these kind of, right? Which I actually think is very telling, right? Because again, it's trading on these ideas that religion is this kind of, right, all the negatives of religion and say, but that idea, like, it's relational, right? And I think what you're expressing is entirely, along the same lines. So too many of the most prominent examples over the last generation or two of what it means to be a public Christian have been examples that have turned a lot of people off. We live in a robust, fractious, loud, media-driven democracy. Like, you're not going to kind of silence other voices. You just have to be out there in the fray as much as possible. And I don't mean that in like a combative sense. I mean, what you're talking about, like, be public, be out there, show other ways.
There's a promise in the baptismal covenant that we all make, that we will share the good news of Jesus Christ in word and deed.
Yeah.
And Episcopalians sometimes struggle with the whole idea of evangelism.
Yeah.
In part because of social conventions and mores about things you should do or not do, so forth. But in many ways, there are opportunities in life. I like to use the phrase teachable moments, I like as an educator, in which you can express a different way of looking at the world. You can incarnate it, embody it for somebody. And I do think that that's something we're all called to do as Christians. It's not just the leaders or the clergy or the institution. We're all called to be evangelists in that way, but in that very invitational way that we're talking about here.
Yeah.
Opening up a new vista for people that they may not really even know exists.
Yeah. I mean, this is making me think, though, that in the end, I mean, there are very good reasons to be concerned about numbers, right? About demographics. It does get to the kind of missional sense of the church and Christianity and all of these things. But I do think, there's the whole kind of church growth, like business, consultancy world. And ultimately, that can become its own kind of
idol.
Well, yes, absolutely.
Right.
One of the compelling, I think, I buy this like argument about one of the reasons for the decline of the main line starting in the 60s and 70s is that, especially at leadership levels, sort of denominational and otherwise, these institutions were prophetic, counterculturally prophetic in ways, especially regarding civil rights, but also regarding, other social changes, the war in Vietnam, feminism, other kinds of things. I think they were, this aligns with my own values, in other ways. But there were lots of people who left the pews over these issues. And one of the reasons for the growth of the evangelical churches was sort of, to put it politely, some social conservatives in the main line around issues of race and gender and other things walked across the street, where they wouldn't be challenged on these questions, right? They wouldn't be forced out of their comfort zones. Now, to my mind, not okay, but that doesn't mean that the church shouldn't have been doing what it was doing. And there is a prophetic, in that sense, obligation, and that can be countercultural. And that might mean for a season, some folks are going to walk out the door.
You're echoing exactly what Presiding Bishop Hines, who was the presiding bishop in the 60s, in the church said in response. I think later, it was in the 70s, he was interviewed. He said, we lost a lot of money, we lost a lot of people, but we did it for the right reason.
Now, I think that's largely true. I also think that you buy that too thoroughly, and you don't look in the mirror and say, we made, there's things that we all did. So this idea of why are conservative churches growing? The best evidence now is that there was this moment where the main line was in decline and conservative churches were growing, and it largely had to do with two factors. One, people walking across the street because they were being challenged in some of their churches on questions of race and gender and sexuality and the war, Vietnam, and these other kinds of things. And because by and large, more conservative religious folks have more kids than more progressive religious folks. And so churches were growing simply on that demographic level. And it didn't have to do with theological questions or, we're preaching the gospel along like these mainliners who have lost their way in social justice pursuits or whatever. It wasn't that at all,
Well, let's open it up to questions now for Matthew. Yes.
On 9/11, people flocked back to church.
Yes.
I don't know if it was the building or it was a comfort zone. I don't know what it was. If that happened today, do you think it would be a little different or a lot different?
Hard to know. Let's hope we never find out the answer to that. Right. There was the big trend lines. It seemed for a second, and this made the news, maybe they're stabilizing in 2020, 2021, and some people said, maybe that had to do with COVID. Even though, all of the stuff about, of course, churches really suffered, that people's sense or need of some kind of community or connection with our politics and how frightening and fractured and those kinds of things are. So, there may be something to that kind of moment of crisis or...
were they coming back to the building or were they coming back to God?
Right. I think, again, this is very recent past. I think the answer is that sort of plateau was just a little blip in the story, that the trend lines are still,
Well, I guess the question is then why did they do it?
Why? Do you have a theory here?
It pulled them back to their roots. Roots for a while.
I'm a Midwesterner, I'll say roots.
And it kind of pulled them back into their comfort. What was like a shell. I'm protected now.
Right.
And then they sort of drifted away from it.
Maybe they wanted something to hold on to.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
something to hold on to, yeah. Yeah, Rosemary.
There's a lot going on with the Celtic spirituality and retreat after retreat, the cathedral of earth, sea, and sky, and all that. And is that part of this spiritual but not religious, do you think, the popularity of Celtic traditions?
I don't know a lot about that, but is that a kind of pre-Christian sort of nature?
Yeah, honoring nature
Yeah.
as part of creation and not having to go to an actual building to
Right.
worship, but you can worship in any natural space.
Yes.
Honoring God as creator, that kind of thing.
Yeah. I mean, again, the sort of history that is often tracked here of the kind of spiritual but not religious, and that fracture often goes back to the 19th century, to Romanticism, the Transcendentalists and others. A lot of that is sort of finding God in nature, right? The book of nature and these kinds of things. And there are many ways of doing that, and pathways to do that within organized Christianity. But if you look at the survey that I give to my students, most meaningful spiritual practices, prayer, meditation, right up at the top of the list, always number 2 is some kind of spending time in the natural world. Whether that's like my morning walk with my dog, or like some cosmic, whatever, the eclipse, like something majestic, right? So Emerson has this great bit in one of his Divinity School address, which is kind of his breakup letter to the organized Christianity, where he talks about sitting in church. He says, I once sat in a sermon that made me think I'll never do this again. Listening to a sermon, he said, as I was listening to this preacher drone on and on and on about nothing, I looked outside and there was this snowstorm whipping up. And he said, God was revealed to me more in that snowstorm than in the sermon, right? I mean, I think that is that's powerful, that is ongoing, and what you're talking about probably speaks to that. And maybe this is another element of how, what the church can listen to.
Yeah.
Nature, the other thing that's always right at the top of the list is the arts in some way. And I still think probably the biggest draw for many folks to church on Sunday, the writer Kathleen Norris talked about this. She's like, for her, she said it was always the music, more than anything.
Okay. Father Rick.
Yeah, I was going to ask, it seems to me that in the context of the university and the students that you work with, that the particular development in their life, at that age, it would seem to me that it would be the perfect time for them to kind of open up about the intellectual questions they have about religion, and I'm sure that's what you talk about, a lot about that. But I'm interested if you've encountered this whole idea of deconstructing that word, deconstructing faith, to try to get to the absolute essential of what that faith is teaching, and maybe reinterpret it in a more metaphorical or imaginative way, and then reconstruct that back to a more practicing faith as they go on. My curiosity here is that, at least in the Christian tradition, the majority of Christian doctrine was pretty well set in place prior to the Enlightenment, in the 14th, 15th century. And so the Enlightenment happens, and I'm thinking particularly of the more evangelical backgrounds. You come of age, and you have some questions, but they're shut down right away.
Yeah.
And so we see the emergence of, other evangelical writers now deconstructing faith and trying to win people back to a new practice. Thinking of Rachel Held Evans as one of the big ones there. Just curious to know from you if that's an object of conversation about deconstruction and reconstruction, or they even care about that at this point.
Yeah, I mean, those who care, right?
Yeah.
I mean, there's a decent percentage of UVA students who are like, religion? Like, oh, I guess I heard that. My grandma used to talk about that. Right? Like, it's not the center of what they... But I will say that it's It's quite lively, and you're right. I mean, to me, one of the sort of tragedies, I guess, is that many UVA students, but this is true broadly. I mean, they're very bright, they're very curious. They can talk to you at a very high level intellectually about what they've learned in their astrophysics class and in their English literature class or whatever. And theologically, they're like 8-year-olds. I mean, because they were presented a kind of simple Sunday school version of things, maybe when they were young, and they just never had the space to ask grown-up questions and to have grown-up conversations, right? And so their intellectual toolkit in certain arenas is just far outpaced what they have available to them. Theologically, now I will say that religious studies department at UVA actually is interesting and distinctive for a religious studies department at a public university, in that there are spaces to study, theology, right? And there are students who are eagerly do that. But by and large, I think your point is well taken, that they're asking children's questions because that's all they have available to them.
Well, and again, a big part of this is that they weren't formed and educated.
Yeah.
I mean, not just by the churches, but by society.
Yeah.
So one challenge that I've seen, I have 3 children in public schools here, you cannot talk about religion. Now, you can. Of course, it's legal. But
Yeah.
you wouldn't have a job if it
Yeah.
wasn't legal to talk about religion in public university.
Yeah.
But educators are so afraid of what might come that they simply leave people in ignorance.
Yeah.
They don't talk about the basic beliefs and practices of different religions. I am here today because the religious studies department in William & Mary, where I went, because of philosophy professors who said, I would like you not just to learn what this person thought, but I'd like you to think about what this means for your life and what's the point of life
Mhm.
and why you're here.
Yeah.
I'm going to challenge you to think through that yourself. But I was allowed to learn about the different beliefs and practices of the major world religions. And that was hugely important for my journey and my growth as a person. And at least before people get to college, you're not allowed to have that conversation. So people truly don't know anything about Islam
Yeah.
or Judaism
Right.
or Christianity even.
Yeah.
And that seems to be a major problem. I'm not sure how to address that, but it's like you're the first person that they're going to meet at 18, 19 years old who might have a chance to say, actually, there's more to it than what you've been taught or not been taught.
Yeah. In the spiritual but not religious class, I have them read a book called Christianity After Religion, which is meaning like, after all the critiques of so this is the perspective of someone who thinks there's still a there.
Yeah,
like
yeah.
after all of this, right? Because I want them to have that sentence. And also on the last day of class, I mean, just as a kind of validation, right? A UVA religious studies class is not Sunday school, it's not a catechism program, it's not, we do the intellectual work that we do, right? But in the last day of class, I kind of just, it's like break down the fourth wall or whatever, and I just say to them, like, I know why a lot of you are here. And it wasn't because you wanted to read Emerson's Divinity School address, right? Which is fabulous, and you all should read it. But you were here because you were asking these questions about, in your own life.
Right.
And I said, one of the reasons that I do what I do is because I believe that the intellectual tools that the Academy has to offer and that the humanities have to offer and everything else can help you do that. And so, it's basically just a validation of like, please continue to do that. Like, yes, yes to that notion that what we're doing here can serve you in those ways, right? It's a little bit, then they have to go and find places and spaces and communities to do that on their own.
Yeah.
But I just really wanted to sort of kind of like say, I see you, like I know, like come on, let's not pretend that we're all.
Well, and you have the potential to make a transformative impact in someone's life through that. I mean, you're meeting people at that
Yeah.
moment where they might be questioning. I use the term religions because I think we're all religious personally.
Yeah.
I think it just depends on what religion you're talking about. We all put our faith and trust in certain things. As Paul Phillips said, we all have our ultimate concern.
Yeah.
And you're at that moment where people are thinking through, what is my ultimate concern? What am I really doing?
Right.
What's this all about?
Right.
And you have an opportunity to potentially broaden people's options and reflection on that. It's a gift.
Yeah, right, it is, you're right. It's, you know, you're gonna be extra nervous going into class tomorrow. Yeah, Eric.
This is a bit of a follow-up on Bob's initial question on 9/11.
9/11, yeah.
So is there research that suggests as one ages, and perhaps looks at their own demise, or goes through a very serious medical scare, is there a trend towards going from spirituality to more formal religion?
Yeah. Right. I'm not a social scientist, but I have a few friends who are, and sometimes I read their stuff. And on the one hand, the demographic breakdown is just like absolutely starkly clear. If you look at the survey data responses, like especially not about God or prayer, but about church. Right? I mean, it just tracks exactly as we would expect and as we all witness, you know. The question is, and the social scientists have terms for this, you know, but basically, is that a life stage thing? In other words, as people age, they get more religious? Or is that a cohort thing like these folks? And from what I understand, most of the social scientists who study this think it's more a cohort thing and less a life stage thing. In other words, and this is not good news, right? In other words, they think it's fairly sticky and that how people get formed early in life, more often than not, tends to be kind of sticky. And so part of the reasons that the trend lines are the way they are is that as older folks are moving off the scene and younger folks are starting to have kids and whatnot, they're continuing in their patterns and are less church going.
I mean, anecdotally, that's just clear in
Yeah.
our context, for sure.
Yeah.
In this Western alma mater.
Right.
Yeah, one more question. Yes, in the back.
What about the publicity surrounding, I'll just say, the moral failures of a lot of large church institutions?
Yep.
For example, pedophile priests,
Yep.
Jerry Falwell Jr.,
Yep.
the money hoarding of the Mormon church.
Yep.
How has that affected attendance? Because I know, for example, our daughter is totally disillusioned.
Yeah.
Like, this is all fake.
It's huge. It's huge. It's absolutely huge. And, you know, for some good reasons. Like, there are a lot of people who have been hurt by their churches. And that can be very directly, I mean, talk about like, pedophile questions and abuse, you know, like abuse things, but also, you know, sort of gay and lesbian folks who grew up in the church, right? In many church contexts, others, very understandably, right? There's a whole growing literature on kind of, you know, like survivor literature, or sort of, or you know, kind of toxic, and I mean, there's that set of issues, and then there's just the sort of broader, I guess you could call it kind of scandal issues, like financial things, or I mean, Jerry Falwell, you know, ridiculous, you know. But people look at that and say, you know, you were talking about them being like a Christian in the world, like for every story like that in the news, there needs to be 100 or 1,000 just like good decent folks out there to kind of to counter that. And I mean, and I'll just say, like, I think that there's a lot of like truth in those critiques. Right? And that's another thing that churches need to do is to live, like, to understand that and to listen to that. Like, how have we hurt people? Like, why is our brand so damaged? Yeah, maybe it's misperceptions and this and that, but maybe it's because we've done a lot of bad crap, you know? And like, we need to repent. And some public repentance would probably go a long ways towards helping churches and their sort of perception issues.
Well, thank you, Matthew, for being with us. Let's give him a round of applause. Go in peace, for love and serve the Lord. Thanks.
Have a good week.